Good evening to you all. I'm Dick Thornburg, the director of the Institute of Politics, and I'm very pleased to welcome all of you this evening to a tribute to Senator Edward M. Kennedy for 25 years in public service. It will not surprise you to learn that between a former Republican governor of Pennsylvania and the senior Democratic senator from Massachusetts, there are certain differences on the issues of the day. But I must say that there are certain views that Ted Kennedy and I hold that are very much in coincidence. First of all, we share a zest and an enthusiasm for the process of elective politics. Secondly, we recognize the need to transmit that zest and enthusiasm to the next generation of leaders, many of whom will come from this Harvard community. And thirdly, we recognize the importance and usefulness of the Institute of Politics in bridging that gap between the academic community and the real world, so-called real world, of politics and government. So for me, it's a particular pleasure to act as the Master of Ceremonies and traffic cop this evening as we join in paying tribute to Ted Kennedy for 25 years of exemplary service as Senator of this state and as a national and world leader. I'm going to call upon this evening a group of associates and friends of Ted Kennedy to reflect on his career and to offer their tributes in their own words as a lead-in to the featured address of the evening, which will be delivered by Senator Kennedy. First of all, I'd like to call upon the Dean of the John F. Kennedy School of Government, Dean Allison, Graham Allison.
I'm greatly honored to salute Senator Edward M. Kennedy for a quarter century of distinguished public service in the Senate of the United States. Others on the program will offer more perspective on his achievement in that body. I'll speak to what I know best, his contributions here at the Kennedy School, not only as the state's senior senator, but as a steady, active partner in building a living memorial to the ideals of public service exemplified by his brother, John Kennedy, and indeed by the remarkable family of Kennedys. For 21 of the past 25 years, he has been unfailingly generous with his time and enthusiasm for the Institute of Politics, as a member of the school's visiting committee, and as a wise counsel. He has been the single most important advocate for creating an institution at Harvard that would inspire young men and women to elective politics. Today, elective politics seems or appears to many to be more closely related to acting or primetime TV than to the teaching and research purposes of a great university. Indeed, many faculty members, even at Harvard, find it easier to scoff at the folly of knaves and fools than to take up the challenge of improving the quality of our public leadership. Whatever our local tendencies to backslide, and whenever we are discouraged by our own failings, Teddy has been there, never wavering in his conviction that electoral politics is the noblest calling of public service, or in his insistence that through the Institute of Politics, this be a vital center of the school that bears his brother's good name. As the fourth son in a family that in some wonderfully mysterious way bred public service into the children's bones, he and his siblings have been acutely aware of the price. The eldest brother died in World War II, the second was assassinated as president, a third was killed as he pursued his party's nomination for the presidency. Weaker hearts counseled retreat, especially in the face of countless threats to Senator Kennedy's own life, but not Edward Kennedy. Without missing a step, he assumed the family's mantle of leadership in public service, steadfastly refusing to compromise his commitment to his values, even when they have been lightning rods for right-wing extremists. Through all his personal adversity, he's held fast to certain guiding stars. As he said on one occasion, quote, "The pursuit of the presidency is not my life. Public service is close quote. Or on another occasion that revealed even more of his heart, he said he would like to be considered, quote, a senator for the average working family, the ones that don't have powerful voices or interests in the Congress of the United States, close quote. The record of his legislative achievements over the past quarter century is extraordinary, not just as champion of equal rights or access to health care, or more recently the Literacy Corps, but also in areas like airline and trucking deregulation, the modernization of the federal criminal law, or even budget cutting. Last May 29th, as we celebrated what would have been John F. Kennedy's 70th birthday and dedicated the new JFK Park, Senator Kennedy said, quote, "Jack has finally come back to Harvard. We at the Kennedy School feel that he's never left. Indeed, we see him and his ideals exemplified in the man we honor this evening, Senator Edward Kennedy."
Thank you, Graham, very much. The Institute of Politics is served by a senior advisory committee, which is made up of leaders from public and private life who serve as counselors to those of us who have the responsibility of overseeing the Institute's day-to-day activities. I'm pleased to introduce the chairman of the Senior Advisory Committee and a distinguished lawyer and politician in his own right, Ron Brown. Ron, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dick. We are, of course, here this evening to praise Senator Kennedy for his, give him well-deserved praise for his 25 years of brilliant public service. In recounting those years, certain pictures and images flash through our minds, images which all of us have when we think about those 25 years. Images of Ted Kennedy fighting on the floor of the Senate for fairness and justice and equity. Images of Ted Kennedy maintaining an impossible public schedule with grace and dignity. Images of Ted Kennedy fighting to protect the interests of the people of Massachusetts. Images of Ted Kennedy electrifying the 1980 Democratic National Convention with his "The Dream Shall Never Die" speech. Images of Ted Kennedy, the leader, driving himself and his staff to do better. Images of Ted Kennedy taking on the tough and often unpopular issues, in effect, sailing against the wind. But I hope that's not the only images, or those are not the only images we see as we reflect on those 25 years. I hope we also see Ted Kennedy earnestly talking to students and young people, genuinely seeking their views and ideas. I hope we also see Ted Kennedy holding and feeding starving children in East Africa. I hope we also see Ted Kennedy playing tennis with the intensity of a middle linebacker, but yet able to laugh when he makes errors, laugh at himself, and he makes enough errors so that he's able to laugh a lot on the tennis court. I hope we see Ted Kennedy visiting a former staff member who is on his deathbed dying of cancer. I hope we see Ted Kennedy kissing his son Teddy. This is the true measure of the man. Ted Kennedy has more character and compassion and concern and caring for people than any man I know. I'd like to salute him on his 25 years of public service, but more important, I'd like to salute him for being one heck of a human being.
Thank you, Ron. If there's one thing that Senator Kennedy has urged on the Institute of Politics throughout his years of affiliation with this organization, it is attention to students and the nurturing of student interests in the political world. Our institute is served by an outstanding group of students who constitute the Student Advisory Committee, and with us this evening to join in this tribute is Claire Fleming, this year's chairman of the Student Advisory Committee. Claire?
While growing up in the Midwest, I often saw your picture on the front page of a local newspaper or on the evening television news. I never thought that I would have the opportunity to meet you or even let alone work with you. But over the past 3.5 years, with my experience here at the Institute, I have indeed had that privilege. It is your dedication to the Institute of Politics which I would like to speak to this evening. I remember that as a freshman, it amazed me that a senator, particularly one as busy as Senator Kennedy, could be so dedicated to a student organization like the Institute of Politics Student Advisory Committee. Those of us who have been involved with the Student Advisory Committee have often enjoyed the helpful suggestions which the senator offers at senior advisory group meetings. He is truly dedicated to the purpose of the student program, and he takes his advisory role to the SAC very seriously. We all appreciate his attention and respect that he has given us. He has always offered helpful advice to student programs as well as insightful suggestions for future directions for these programs. He too has always been there to lend support and encouragement to students. But Senator Kennedy's dedication has not only been expressed through words, he has most certainly been dedicated to the student program in action as well. His commitment to students and student programs are clearly expressed and can be seen whether it is taking time to talk with students over a cup of coffee about the outcome of the 1986 elections or agreeing to an interview with the Harvard Political Review. There's also the time that he flew halfway across the country despite being ill to make an appearance at a high school leadership conference that the Student Advisory Committee was sponsoring. These are only a few examples of the commitment that I have seen by Senator Kennedy over my past 3.5 years here at the Institute. But it is this kind of dedication that students have enjoyed since the founding of the Institute over 20 years ago. Recently, I was asked to write a fellowship essay explaining how I had learned and grown here at Harvard. I cited working with Senator Kennedy as a major educational and broadening opportunity that I had experienced here. Senator Kennedy, working with you has indeed been an unforgettable experience. It has been both a privilege and an honor. For your time spent with students, your guidance, and your overall dedication to the Institute of Politics, I thank you.
To demonstrate that the senator's interest in the students is not just a sometime matter, but indeed stretches back over the years, and to provide us with a further perspective, I'm pleased to introduce Paul Holtzman, who was chairman of the Student Advisory Committee at the Institute of Politics in the class of 1982. Paul?
As Claire Fleming and Ron Brown know, the annual visit of the Senior Advisory Committee to the Institute is always a hectic and an exciting time. Participants in each of the Institute's programs are anxious to speak of the year's accomplishments and hear the suggestions and ideas of the distinguished members of that committee. During my time at the Institute, it was always a challenge to the diplomatic skills of even so even-handed a moderator as Jonathan Moore to keep the agenda moving and the time evenly allocated. Despite Ambassador Moore's best efforts, however, the schedule always seemed to go awry around midday at the time of the presentation of the Student Advisory Committee. For it seemed that each time that Jonathan tried to move on to the next scheduled presentation, a firm glance from over a pair of half glasses would signal that Senator Kennedy had yet another question to ask. Looking up from the charts and graphs of our annual report, the senator would probe the reason for a 3.1% increase or decrease in student study group attendance, or ask which visiting fellows were being considered for the fall. It wasn't that Senator Kennedy wasn't interested in faculty research projects or the motto for yet another new wing of this building. It was simply that he had another question to ask about the student program, usually a question for a student who had not yet had a chance to speak. The senator's flurry of questions each year reflected a long-standing and energetic commitment to the Institute's student programs. For a full generation of undergraduates passing through the IOP, Senator Kennedy's interest in this program has been a resource of immeasurable value. At the dedication of this school in 1978, Senator Kennedy called the Institute a magnet between the university and elective office. It is a magnet whose force has touched many students over the years. In no small part, it's been the Senator's personal commitment to and love for this institution that has kept that magnet at full strength over the years. Radcliffe and Harvard students who have listened in this forum, debated in study groups, or with fellows over dinner in the houses have all been the beneficiaries of the energies so consistently given the Institute by Senator Kennedy. The 400 students from 65 New England colleges who attended our 1982 training conference here entitled Education for Action in a Nuclear World were also beneficiaries, because that program to teach skills of political organizing and grassroots and lobbying grew out of a suggestion from Senator Kennedy and a discussion at one of those extended meetings of the Senior Advisory Committee. As with the nuclear conference, as associates and members of the Student Advisory Committee, hundreds of undergraduates have had the additional privilege, as Claire mentioned, of working in common cause with the Senator to maintain the vitality and creativity that is the heart of the IOP. In another sense, the Senator has himself been a magnet, for his example of a life devoted to the service of the public has itself sparked in so many students an interest in public life. From the class of 1982 of the Student Advisory Committee, I'm glad to report that the ideal of public service still glows, and among others, the founder of the country's first PAC supporting candidates committed to freedom in South Africa, the founder of a tenants' rights group for the elderly of South Brooklyn, a candidate for the Boston School Committee, several Hill staffers, and more than a few campaign junkies and law students with a pronounced bent toward public interest law of one stripe or another. While it's true that the law schools and business schools have had their share of IOP alums, I fervently believe that our exposure to the public service example of Senator Kennedy and others has contributed mightily to the ability of most to fend off the well-funded entreaties of corporate law and Wall Street banks. In looking to horizons broader than mergers and buyouts, Institute alumni draw on both specific policy interests developed here and a pervasive spirit of public service and interest in the electoral process acquired through long days of planning on the Institute's second floor, cheeseburgers with staff members and fellows at Charlie's Kitchen. To have benefited from Senator Kennedy's vision and commitment to this institute is a privilege for which we will always be grateful. And it is a privilege which we can repay best by following the Senator's example and giving something of ourselves in the pursuit of the public good.
Thank you, Paul. It's now my particular pleasure to welcome back to the Institute of Politics and the John F. Kennedy School of Government to give us additional perspective over the years, my distinguished predecessor, Jonathan Moore, now Ambassador for Refugee Affairs in the United States Department of State and a world traveler in the interest of human rights around the world. Jonathan, welcome home.
Thank you, Governor. Several years ago, in this same hall, the Institute was sponsoring its Presidential Candidate Series, and it fell upon me to introduce Senator Kennedy, then a candidate for the Democratic nomination. Mindful of the need for a measure of neutrality, I tried to conceal the lack of hard support in my remarks with increased rhetoric and decibels. No such luck. He immediately rejoined, "Well, that was almost an endorsement." This time, Senator, since as we know, I suffer under no similar constraints of bipartisanship, you get the full treatment. And I have the unelapsed time that was used by the people who have preceded me here with their brief remarks. During Senator Kennedy's 25 years of service in the U.S. Senate, he served this university, including this school and most especially its Institute of Politics. Two of the programs at the Institute, which he supported with the greatest personal delight, were the students and the fellows. The students because they represented the future energy and devotion in public service. The fellows because they represented political refugees, if not persecuted, at least abused and exhausted, in need of nourishment and care. It is the Senator's commitment to refugees in a more literal sense that I want to celebrate tonight, which you may not hear about as much about as you hear about other things. The first time we met after he became senator, it was in 1966, and I was up on the Hill to brief him for the State Department for a trip he was taking to investigate the plight of civilian casualties and refugees in Southeast Asia. He had joined the Refugee Subcommittee of the Senate Judiciary Committee immediately following his election, became its chairman in 1965, and has remained its leader or ranking member ever since. He worked hard on the Immigration Reform Act of 1965, chairing hearings and floor managing his first major legislation. He struggled on the miseries of Biafra, Bangladesh, and the Sahel, working for the Indochina refugees and the continuing outflows from Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and held hearings on the Cuban-Haitian crisis. He was the prime Senate sponsor of the Reform Refugee Act of 1980. He led the call for help in the Ethiopian exodus in 1984-85, and a year ago pressed our attention to the worsening situation in Mozambique. Each year, he asserts a leading role in the consultation process which sets the worldwide ceilings for admission of refugees to the United States. He made his subcommittee the watchdog of humanitarian affairs of the U.S. Senate. It is typical of Senator Kennedy's personification of the principle that human caring must translate into effective public policy, brought about by resourceful and dogged political effort, that once he had become a champion of the refugees, he stuck to it, despite the demands and distractions of more prominent causes. And the refugees, the wounded, starving, vulnerable, heroic refugees across the globe, and those others of us who work for them, continue to benefit immensely from his compassionate and tenacious leadership. In simple, unadorned language, Senator Kennedy opened hearings earlier this year on the refugee crisis in southern Africa. Quote, "I have continued to follow closely the issues of immigration and refugees, both overall questions involving immigration to the United States, the way refugees are treated abroad, the reunification of families, asylum, and all those people who look to our country as a source of hope and inspiration. We will try and focus on some of the very important human needs that exist in other parts of the world and how we as a country and as a society are dealing with those issues. They offer, I think, enormous opportunities for leadership," unquote. Keep on focusing, Senator. We want a lot more from you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Richard Neustadt was the first director of the Institute of Politics. He is recognized today as the reigning authority on the subject of the presidency. But perhaps most importantly, he brought a warm glow to this institution and his colleagues in this chill of the fall with word of his impending nuptials. His marriage upcoming to Shirley Williams, a member of the Senior Advisory Committee of the Institute of Politics. And that, my friends, is pure subversion. But he joins us this evening to present his tribute to Senator Kennedy. Dick.
I think it's fair to say, Ted, that I'm trying to bore from within. Get some influence on that Senior Advisory Committee. I believe that I'm invited here in my capacity as the first director of the Institute. There isn't much that I can say that hasn't already been said by the dean, and by the students, and by Jonathan. I have another capacity. And in that first capacity, I'll come to that in a minute. In the first capacity, let me only say that when the Institute was starting, and the school, in its new character, was very new, and there wasn't much of a school, and there was only the beginnings of an institute. Bob Kennedy and his brother Ted, who took over the responsibility for helping us on behalf of the interested and concerned family after Bob died. The two of them were marvelously supportive. And by supportive, I don't mean that they were acquiescent. They sometimes agreed with what we were doing. They often disagreed. They stated their agreements. They let us know. When we decided otherwise, they accepted with good grace. That's remarkable. But they did not stop making clear of their views of what we might have done, should have done, and could have done. And indeed, I can think of one or two subjects in which the senator is still of the view that we went astray in some respects, could have done more in other respects. And I have to say here, to end this particular topic, the older I get, the more I think he may have had a point. Which is to show it's fortunate that I'm the professor and he's the senator. But I have a second capacity, which I can claim to some expertise on Ted Kennedy, and I want just a word for this. I am one of the dwindling band of surviving members of Harry Truman's White House staff. And one of the chief legislative efforts of Truman's 7 years was to give reality to the third dimension of what originally was understood by the term Social Security, namely health insurance. In 1934, President Roosevelt's Committee on Economic Security had recommended a three-part insurance scheme for Americans: old age insurance, unemployment compensation, and comprehensive health insurance, a minimal support for people who were sick. And President Roosevelt, a foxy gentleman, decided that he didn't want to risk the opposition of the AMA to old age insurance and unemployment compensation, so he held off on health insurance. In 1937, he wrote a note, which I discovered subsequently in the files, to his then budget director, saying, this was 2 years after the Wagner Act of '35 that created old age insurance and unemployment compensation. Roosevelt wrote a note saying, Dan, I want to get on with health insurance, but let's wait till after the next congressional election. The '38 congressional election ended all possibilities for a generation. It created a conservative coalition that dominated Congress on welfare schemes into LBJ's time. Truman picked up the gauge in 1945, and for years, with the help of Senator Wagner and Senator Murray of Montana, fought to get comprehensive health insurance enacted. We came close to success once, but the Korean War intervened. And the other thing that intervened was the American Medical Association's moves into politics frontally, the financial support for candidates who would oppose what they called socialized medicine, and that so scared the political community that nothing could be done again until Johnson's time. And even Johnson, even Lyndon Johnson, decided he had to be content with the entering wedge of Medicare, that it was not possible to go farther. And then along comes Ted. And now, ever since then, he has been refusing to accept anything short of the underlying principle that was first enunciated in this country by the the President's Committee on Economic Security in 1934 and was first enunciated by a president in 1945 and was fought for by two extraordinary senators, Murray and Wagner, especially Bob Wagner, one of the great men in social reform in our modern history in the United States Senate. And I think one ought to understand that Ted in his 25 years has managed to give himself a claim on being Bob Wagner's successor. Thanks.
Thank you, Dick. To introduce our featured honoree and speaker of the evening, I have the great privilege of welcoming to you and presenting to you President of Harvard University, Derek Bok. Derek.
Thank you very much. It's a great privilege to be able to be here and participate in this celebration of 25 years of public service. I remember that it was the first year of my presidency. That's very long ago, too long ago, but it was on a fall day in which I was invited to have lunch with Senator Kennedy and with Jackie Kennedy in her New York apartment and talk about the Institute of Politics. Literally only 2 or 3 months after I had taken office, I was beset with problems so numerous and intense that I could scarcely imagine how to cope with them, and now I was to hear about one more. I remember it was a lovely day with a beautiful view of Central Park, and I remember discussing before lunch, during the warm-up period, discussing with Senator Kennedy the problem of Vietnamese refugees, 1971, and their needs. And I remember reflecting what an interesting issue that was, because for me, who knew almost no one in public life, it would be very interesting to see how much a very busy senator of the United States really knew about that problem, in which he had been prominently identified, but which clearly carried no great political mileage whatsoever in furthering whatever ambitions in public life he might have. And I remember how impressed I was in the course of our conversation at the detailed knowledge that he had of the nature of the problem, the costs of prosthetic devices, of all kinds of details that bore upon what the United States could do to alleviate the unspeakable misery of those whose lives had been disrupted and whose bodies had been maimed by a conflict in which they had no responsibility whatsoever. That was a very impressive exchange for me that helped reinforce, I think, my most optimistic sentiments about public servants and the ideals that can animate them at their best. Thereafter, we had a lunch, and the talk turned to the Institute of Politics, and we had what the State Department likes to describe as a full and frank exchange. That was a period in which the Kennedy School and the Institute of Politics and Harvard in general were trying to make do with this new enterprise of preparation for public service with greatly inadequate resources, and I'm sure in trying to do everything at once, we were doing nothing particularly well. But we certainly heard both from Senator Kennedy and from Jackie Kennedy their ideal of what an Institute of Politics might accomplish, their concerns about whether we were headed in the right direction. And since that time, I like to feel that the senator in his way and I in mine have, and a great many other people, have really labored to try to make of the Institute of Politics something much closer to the ideal which he articulated that day and which animated his brother, the idea of really building a sturdy bridge, an attractive bridge between the academy and the world of political life and elective office. And although he must speak for himself, I like to believe that both he and I think that a great deal of progress has been made in pursuit of that ideal in the intervening years. A great deal of that credit for that progress goes to the directors, the distinguished directors of the Institute who are here tonight. But apart from those who labor full-time on the work of the Institute, no one deserves more credit than the senior senator from Massachusetts. In all the ways that have been described here tonight, his constant effort to come here, take an interest in the Institute, particularly in the work that the students do, has really been, as you have heard tonight, an inspiration to us all. And to me, as a president of this institution, I can only say that what he has done really exemplifies the role of Harvard alumni at their best. Very critical, but critical because they care, and they care as all of us should care about participating in the endlessly fulfilled task of trying to make this institution realize something close to its potential in the service of humane causes, and in helping us come closer to a very important cause. We owe him a great debt of gratitude. So it's my distinct pleasure to present to you tonight Harvard's most impressive living embodiment of that dedication, lifelong dedication to public service that represents in the last analysis the ideal of the Institute of Politics and the ideal of this school that bears the name of the Kennedy family. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to President Derek Bach. Just before we came down to this assembly, we met with some of those who have spoken this evening and some of those who have had a long-time association with the Kennedy School of Government and the Institute of Politics. And I had mentioned there, just very informally, but I welcome the opportunity to repeat it to perhaps a broader audience this evening, that President Kennedy was proud of his association with Harvard, proud of the role that they played during his period of the New Frontier, and I know that I speak for all the members of the Kennedy family in saying how proud he would have been if he were here today to pay a tribute to this school of government that bears his name, and to the Institute of Politics, which plays such a important and lively role in hopefully in inspiring a new generation into public life and to public service. And so many of those who have spoken this evening have made this possible, from President Bach, who reviewed with us those early meetings, which were meetings of love in terms of the members of our family and a leader of a great university, not only of our country, of the world, and his willingness to speak with us and to work closely. Then with Dick Neustadt, one of the early designers, Ken Galbraith, who advised the members of the family as we were establishing the Institute. The Jonathan Moore, one of the earliest director, now succeeded by Governor Thornburg, who I know has been challenged by that opportunity and giving great time and direction to the students, to Ron Brown, who is our director of the advisory committee, and to Claire Fleming and Paul Holtzman, who spoke so well and reminded us of those past meetings. Again, my thanks, and to Graham Allison, the dean, for his continued good work. To all of them, I'm indeed indebted. They talk about 25 years. That's a long time to be in the United States Senate. At least that's what my Republican colleagues keep telling me. I just wish that my mother and father could be here now. The old saying is very apt. My mother would enjoy every minute of it, and my father wouldn't have believed a word of it. Seriously, I am grateful for this honor and happy to be back at Harvard and at this school. John Kennedy, who has been described by William Manchester as probably the best-read president of the 20th century, also had perhaps the strongest conception of any modern president about the connection between public life and intellectual life. In a commencement address here more than 30 years ago, he spoke of the university as an active force and assailed the notion that it could be wholly detached or largely indifferent. To him, this did not mean that the university should be a compliant servant of government, a mere supplier of research, a mental factory to restock the arsenals of authority. Instead, he valued the tension between what he called power and poetry, and viewed the tension as a source of both creativity and correction. Today, this school not only bears John Kennedy's name, but carries forward his conviction that the power of ideas can enrich, refine, and rein in the ideas of power. He would have appreciated the fact that the school now encompasses as well the study of the press and its impact on politics and public policy. For he saw newspapers and television increasingly becoming mechanisms for hurrying history, means to sit in instant judgment of events only hours old, not only in editorials but in virtually every story, even more now than in the 1960s. The press is becoming explicitly judgmental and therefore more directly influential. Tonight, for a few moments, I would like to reflect on all this in the context of the presidential present national campaign. Few subjects in public life need more serious reflection and have received less of it. Few enterprises evoke more predictable patterns of press behavior and comment. And no element of our politics is more important. A presidential election is more than a game, a melodrama, or a mini-series. Whether we are conscious of it or not, we are in the midst of deciding how the most powerful nation on earth will conduct itself for at least the next 4 years. And the choices made during that period will have consequences for decades or generations to come. In the remarks that follow, I do not intend to be comprehensive. I leave that for scholarly minds and hands at places like this, where the post-election studies will be written, footnoted, and debated in far greater depth. Nor do I pretend to be entirely objective. No one who has been a presidential candidate ever could be. But my experience in national campaigns, winning and losing, from 1960 to 1980, has left me with a very real sense of a widening gap between the real issues and the reporting, a feeling that the voters are not seeing candidates whole or clearly, but through a journalistic lens increasingly honed to the prism of People magazine or Entertainment Tonight. The problem is not entirely the fault of the press. The candidates themselves may rightfully deserve some share of the blame, but they are out there in the vortex of events, captive to the imperatives of minting a 30-second soundbite, gaining a headline, winning the battle of quotable quotes. Frequently, events matter less than what is now widely referred to as spin control. Who in which campaign can explain why something doesn't mean what it seems? I think I speak for many Americans when I suggest that there are some things wrong with this process. Let me discuss 3 concerns and how they are affecting the Democratic primary campaign. First, our attention appears to be riveted on politics at the expense of issues. To some extent, that has always been the case. But this year, probably because 2 candidates were driven from the race early, we have experienced a primary election level of coverage long before there were any caucuses or primaries to cover. This could be useful if it was used to tell us in specific issue terms what candidates actually think. Instead, staff shakeups, major and minor alike, command more space than a major speech. Stories of palace intrigue inside campaigns involving names the public never heard of and squabbles none of the public care about fill columns of newsprint with material that isn't news. Nothing more clearly manifests the distorted political bent of the coverage than the obsession with polls. Everybody takes them, everybody trumpets them, and everybody treats them as the near equivalent of an election. Candidates move up and down, gain or lose attention and money, are perceived to be stalled or surging, and nobody bothers to ask how accurate such pre-caucus and pre-primary surveys are likely to be, or have been in the past. They did not predict the rise of Jimmy Carter in 1976, or the decline of Walter Mondale in 1984. In 1979, the November poll said there was no way I could lose Iowa. And in 1980, the March poll said there was no way I could win New York. The polls did not pick up the McGovern movement early in 1972 or the McCarthy breakthrough of 1968. Yet now polls have been the quintessential pseudo-events of the pre-primary campaign. They may tell us something, but they don't tell us everything. Perhaps we cling to them because they offer us numbers, and the numbers confer a certain appearance of reality. It is the statistical analog of false consciousness. It is false objectivity. Or perhaps the seductive pull of the numbers reflects a resistance to the harder work of dealing with issues on their own terms. If the focus was not on who's ahead in surveys, endorsements, money, and Iowa trips, attention would have to be paid to what the candidates are saying, not about each other, not about the process, but about principles, problems, and possible solutions. Instead, serious candidates can be all but read out of the race before a single election is run. Bruce Babbitt has a thoughtful and courageous approach to questions like third world debt, but voters hardly know it at all. There is little room for that in newspaper coverage, which often seems designed primarily as a campaign manager's newsletter. So Governor Babbitt is probably best known in Iowa for riding a bicycle across the state. He realized the relative press value of discussing the danger of a banking collapse versus pedaling his 10-speed into Des Moines. And you can't blame him for acting accordingly. In a similar vein, the Reverend Jesse Jackson has advanced alternative policies in areas ranging from relations with Cuba to the agricultural economy. You don't have to agree with him to recognize the seriousness of his views. But most voters haven't read a word about most of Jackson's platform. The reports they see essentially rehash the same old stories. What percentage of the black vote he will hold? Who will be hurt by his candidacy? And how will he act at the convention? Speculation on which I suspect he himself has spent very little time. The campaign has become a grinding cattle show in which all the incentives are to play for short-term advantage. The way to win debates is to plan out the best one-liner, to search for your own version of, "There you go again," or "I paid for that microphone," which itself was originally borrowed from a Spencer Tracy movie. Thus, Al Gore, who has something important to say about national security, could hardly be heard on the subject until he finally met the demand for political shorthand, for terms like liberal litmus test and soft or hard on defense. Let me note, by the way, that all of us who have run in recent years have experienced similar demands and sometimes succumbed to them. We have supplied the cameras with a steady diet of visuals, contrived appearances where we may meet no voters at all, but where we can find a backdrop, a real-life movie set, so that in the scramble for airtime, an anonymous producer won't dismiss an important statement as boring, it's just a talking head. And every candidate has paid the price of pungent prose when that seemed to be the only way to get the camera turning. Good visuals and good lines have their rightful place, but they are not the center of a campaign or a government, despite Mr. Deva's once relentless attempt to turn the Reagan administration into a series of visuals and slogans, in effect a permanent campaign. And what is happening in this campaign represents a further Reaganization of the public dialogue, which leads me to my second concern. What issues coverage there is now becomes largely in the form of labels, and if the candidates won't supply them, then the press will. It is easier to deal in caricature than complexity, and while there are journalistic exceptions, too many reporters have taken the easy way out. For example, while I do not fully agree with Dick Gephardt on the issue, his trade bill is not an across-the-board, smoot-hawley tariff increase. To dismiss it as protectionist is to miss the reality. It is, in fact, a complex proposal involving a series of steps which conceivably could result in lowering trade barriers. The bill deserves to be debated in detail, not on the basis of stereotypes, and it ought at least to be read by those who are writing about it. In the same spirit, those who are writing about Mike Dukakis ought to listen to what he actually said. In terms of the Massachusetts miracle, he never has claimed he did it all. But he does have a clear claim to leadership, to seeing what government could do and getting it done. And because of him, this Commonwealth was prepared to take maximum advantage of national economic change. It is simply not relevant to object that national trends played a vital role, or that others have helped shape the miracle. The governor knows that and has never suggested otherwise. His role in the Massachusetts miracle is not an all-or-nothing proposition, but it was and is a central role in which he has pioneered new ideas and incentives for economic development. Where is the detailed coverage of that, of initiatives like the Office of State Planning or the revitalization of Taunton or Lowell? As the campaign wears on, sifting the political news on page after page, relegating issues to an occasional obligatory story, another phenomenon, which is my third concern, comes to pervade the process. Candidates are raised up only to be torn down, and to justify that, the whole field is falsely characterized as unimpressive and insubstantial. It's now happening to Paul Simon. I know him well, and he is a man of principle, and not simply because he refuses to give up his bow tie, which the press then took as a prize visual. Now that his reason has seemingly dawned, we have seen a rush of stories revealing in reproachful terms that he doesn't have a plan to pay for every proposal he has ever made. That is hardly news about him or virtually any presidential candidate in this field or in my memory. When was the last time a platform was enacted whole in a law? Proposals give a sense of a candidate's priorities, of values, of hopes. They point a direction, but they cannot predict an entire presidency. To profess surprise that not every dime or dollar is accounted for in advance echoes the comment of the police inspector in Casablanca. Rick, I'm shocked to find out that gambling is going on in here. That kind of shock is no substitute for a genuine examination of issues. But at least on the Democratic side, it is virtually the only kind of examination we have had. And as each candidate's season passes, much of the press, in self-fulfilling disappointment, renews the suggestion that they are all dwarfs anyway. If there is a pack journalism this year, that is its common chord. I happen to think that Governor Dukakis is the best candidate, and I'm working to elect him. But in my view, he is the best of a very good set of candidates. The complaint that there were giants in other days, running in other campaigns, a complaint amplified by the question, where are they now, represents an even deeper disregard for history than obsession with pre-primary polls. Often the giants, too, were at first dismissed as dwarfs in their own time. Lincoln was derided as a party hack with no executive experience. And the assault came not only from his enemies, but from those who should have been his friends. Wendell Phillips assailed him as a huckster, and William Lloyd Garrison called him a coward who would block emancipation. Franklin Roosevelt was dismissed by Walter Lippmann as an amiable man of no consequence. The new republic weighed in that he was not a man of great intellectual force or supreme moral stamina, which sounds like some of what the New Republic writes about candidates today. Listen to some of the other things that were said of FDR, and you will hear the cliches of 1987. Here are sentences from The Nation magazine. His candidacy arouses no real enthusiasm. There is no evidence whatever that people are turning to Roosevelt. There is small hope for better things in his candidacy. Come forward a generation to 1960, and Walter Lippmann does it again. He urges that John Kennedy step aside so Adlai Stevenson can be drafted. And later in the year, Arthur Schlesinger has to write a book to refute another journalist's view, widely repeated, that there is no difference between Kennedy and Nixon. Obviously, in 1987, there are many who have forgotten history, for they surely are repeating it. But now the message of mediocrity is applied to a field of candidates, is woven like a thread through most of the coverage, and magnified by the increasingly powerful technology of the information age. People and politicians, candidates and non-candidates alike, are left asking, is this any way to pick a president? Yet I also reject the argument that the central answer is systemic, that it depends on another round of reform, a new set of rules. A single national primary would make the capacity to raise money even more decisive, and a multi-candidate race would put a high premium on polarizing the party. There may be a case for some kind of regional primaries, but there are also sensible objections. No system is perfect, and who would want to return to the time when a controlled convention could deny the clear preference of the people? I think Iowa is as good a place to start as any, and as you may recall, I don't have any self-interest in saying that. I also think that the press can do a better job of reflecting on its own role and recognizing that the choice ultimately belongs to voters, not reporters. Journalists, no matter how they act, will inevitably influence the process. The Heisenberg principle applies to presidential politics as well as physics. Observing an event changes it. Nor would any of us want a press corps reporting only the facade of the campaign. But here are some things I think we can do. Candidates should be able to discuss campaign coverage without fear of being assailed as whiners or complainers or agents of repression. I see no prospect for a resurgence of Agnewism, which in any case consumed its own perpetrator. I do see a reason for an honest public dialogue founded on mutual respect, and no reason why a candidate should not be free to give a speech like this. At the same time, the press can resist the standard of the lowest common denominator, the rationalization that all news is fit to print if it has appeared anywhere else in any barely respectable newspaper. There are hard questions here, but they are no excuse for not settling easy ones. Newspapers don't have to decide all the circumstances on which it's proper to follow someone around in order to decide that it's time to follow issues more seriously and more thoroughly. Handicapping the race is irresistible, but it is clearly not the ceasingly beating heart of a campaign journalism. Finally, we can approach presidential elections with at least a minimal sense of consequence in history. Why not give stories historical context? Theodore White told us what went on inside a campaign, but he also related it to what had gone on in other generations and other campaigns. And those who borrow his approach should not leave half of it behind. Soon, much of what I have discussed here truly will be academic, the province of scholars, political scientists, and historians. As the pace of events carries us past Iowa and New Hampshire and Super Tuesday, as Time and Newsweek and the networks feature and celebrate the winner, we will hear no more talk of dwarfs, and the result, no matter what it is, will appear to have been inevitable, or at least expected. It is always easier to read the tea leaves after the cup is drained. But I also hope that here at this school, at the Press Center, and maybe even in the wider arena of public dialogue, we will continue to think about how the tea was brewed. about the roles we all played, politicians and press, as well as voters, and we make the most decisive choice in the public life of the world, let us recall the words of T.H. Huxley. The medieval university looked backwards. It professed to be a storehouse of old knowledge. The modern university looks forward. It is the source of new knowledge. And when the subject is presidential politics in 1987, we are all teachers, we are all students, and we all have a lot to learn.